How did module of the week become a part of Talking Drupal? Do you remember the beginning?
So, Module of the Week as a part of Talking Drupal sort of long predates my involvement. They had, I think, from very early days, had that as notionally part of the structure
Mm-hmm.
of Talking Drupal. But I think what I've heard is that kind of over time, it wasn't really something that they necessarily would plan ahead each week, and so sometimes they would show up and they would think of one and then they would cover it, but oftentimes they would go, sometimes several episodes without covering any at all. And I was, I think, one of the early people who was invited to be a guest host
Mm-hmm.
and then had been a guest for a couple of different episodes. And I think when I was on the show,
Mm-hmm.
they would have that conversation at the start of the show around, do we have a module of the week? And oftentimes there had been one that, I had just been working with, or something like that. So I would often have a suggestion, and so I think it was after I had been a guest host, and then I guess a couple of times that they kind of thought, okay, well, maybe there's a role for Martin in more of an ongoing capacity, specifically since he always seems to have ideas for module of the week, that could sort of be a way for him to stay involved with the show on more of an ongoing basis. And so then, yeah, Stephen approached me, asked if I'd be interested in covering that on that as sort of the ongoing correspondent role, and I thought it would be great. And I've really enjoyed continuing to do that. I get lots of good feedback when I'm at
Mm-hmm.
different events like DrupalCon, and I just really consider it kind of a privilege to be able to highlight the hard work that I know a lot of these developers and maintainers put into providing these oftentimes very interesting capabilities, and so being able to give them exposure, I feel like hopefully gives them a level of sort of validation, maybe satisfaction that the hard work that they've put in is going to be used by more people.
Nice. Okay. So do you remember the episode that you came on board for as a correspondent? The number?
I don't. I'm pretty sure it was, I want to say somewhere around 375, I would guess. I remember I was regularly involved with the show before we recorded episode 400,
Mm-hmm.
which was a couple of years ago. But I feel like it was probably not like a full year before that. So yeah, that'd be my guess, somewhere around 370 or
75,
so.
70. Okay. So I just wanted to ask, so were you a listener of Talking Drupal before getting involved in the capacity of the guest host or guest? How did you come across Talking Drupal?
So it's actually a funny story. I had been at a customer meeting once, and somebody who was on the marketing side was explaining to his colleagues how one of the strategies that he used to stay up to date on sort of ongoing developments in internet marketing and some of the other sort of rapidly evolving fields was that he spent a lot of time during his daily commute stuck in traffic, and so he would use that time to listen to podcasts, and that was sort of like his way of devoting the time to learning and self-improvement. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, I do have different parts of my week where I'm sitting in the car, so maybe this could be a good way for me to try and develop some of my own skills as well. And so um, the next time I was kind of in the car about to undertake a long drive, I went onto my phone and looked up Drupal podcasts, and Talking Drupal was the first one that I found. So I started to listen, and actually the very first episode that I listened to, during the intro, they used to just sort of do a little bit of back and forth about what are the things that they're interested in or have been exploring the previous week. And Nick was talking about reading a blog post that I had written a couple of weeks before. And so it was just funny that the very first time I ever listened to the podcast, there was Nick talking about something that I had written. And so immediately there was sort of a personal connection there. I continue to listen to it, would sometimes go into sort of the Slack channel and, have some commentary and some back and forth there. And I think that's really just sort of, being a regular and sort of vocal participant of some of those conversations is really how I came to be more involved in the show.
I get it. Okay. So did you know Stephen or Nick or John before you listening to Talking Drupal, or Did you reach out to them? How did
No,
the
I didn't.
connection start?
Yeah, I didn't know any of them before I started listening to the show. And I think actually after I started listening to them once or twice, I reached out to them to be like, hey, I just wrote this module. Maybe we could talk about it on the show sometime, something like that, and never really got any response. And it was
Mm-hmm.
really, as I say, more just after some of the active conversations that we had had in the Talking Drupal Slack channel
Mm-hmm.
that eventually they reached out and asked if I'd be interested in being a guest host.
Okay, how was the experience? You've been a guest host, you've been a guest, and you've been also constantly working with the podcast in the capacity of a correspondent. So, how was the three experiences different?
Uh, I would say there's definitely different elements for each of them.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, being a guest is probably the easiest because you can just sort of show up and they'll usually have a list of questions prepared. Sometimes I'll go in beforehand and just see if there's a couple of things that I want to sort of weave in
Mm-hmm.
there, or even plan out some of my answers a little bit. But I feel like the module of the week, even though it's definitely the shortest in terms of the amount of time I'll be vocally part of the actual podcast that gets created, there's, at least the way I like to do it, a fair bit of setup time in terms of thinking about what's something that's potentially relevant to sort of the main topic, and then going in doing a little bit of research around how does the module work. Is it well maintained? And usually I prefer to feature a module that is up to date with sort of the latest major version of Drupal and some of those kinds of things. So there's a bit of a selection process. There's a bit of understanding how the module works so that I can sort of talk about it. And then usually what I find is that once we get talking about it with the hosts and the guests, that they'll come up with questions. So if I have a little bit of an understanding about how the module is put together and hopefully how it works, then usually that makes for a better discussion as well. So that one is the shortest in terms of the involvement with the actual recording, but probably has the most sort of prep time. And then when I'm sometimes on as like the guest host or as like a fill-in for if John or Nick are on vacation, then obviously I'm on for more of the actual recording, but certainly I have not had to do any of the substantial work that they have to do in terms of things like scheduling guests or editing video and getting the files put up to different social channels and those kinds of things as well. So I kind of feel like I have it easy in terms of the amount of work that I have to do compared to what I know that they're doing. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I definitely have enjoyed each of those in different ways. And I do find that when there are weeks where if I'm traveling and I just can't make the recording, or sometimes we'll actually just take a break, that I do kind of miss the interaction and getting to you know just have the banter with the rest of the folks involved with the podcast.
Okay, I get it. So, do people approach you to feature their modules in Talking Drupal?
Sometimes, yeah, it
Yeah.
feels like for whatever reason it's gotten a bit less lately, and I don't know if that's just you know people are hard at work on different things. I certainly don't feel like there's been a slowing down of new modules being created, but yeah, I would say maybe once every month or two, I get people who will reach out and say, here's a module that we just made or something like that, and usually we'll try and get that in the queue. Again, because I try and get them aligned with the topic that we're talking about for the podcast. Sometimes it takes a while before they actually make it into a recording,
Mm-hmm.
but I certainly wouldn't be offended if people sort of um, reached out to me with a reminder either, if there was one we talked about and maybe it had just sort of you know fallen out of visibility, I guess.
Okay, okay. So you've been involved with the podcast for quite some time now. Do you have any favorite episodes? Like
Do I
something
have
that
any
stuck?
what?
Favorite episodes? Favorite?
Oh,
Something that stuck?
fa- favorite episodes. Um, it's hard to think. I mean, definitely it was fun to do the recording with Dries for episode 400.
Hmm?
That was a good conversation. I feel like the episode that we did about storage entities was pretty interesting. That was one that, as guest host, I think I had suggested that as the topics, kind of, my episode.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up being a good discussion. I think Nick was really excited about it because he had actually used it for a migration. And so for me as a maintainer, it was really interesting to sort of hear his firsthand experience of having used it and some of those kinds of things. So that one kind of stands out, I guess, a bit in my memory.
All right. So you've been a person who is actively involved in the community. You attend a lot of events, you become a speaker. So do people recognize you from your voice?
I have had that happen. Yes. I was
Yeah.
talking to somebody after having given a presentation, and, as I was speaking to him, you could see sort of like a little tweak in his face, and he says, "Oh, are you on the Talking Drupal podcast?" And, yeah. So anyway, it was funny to get
That,
recognized from my voice. He
okay,
actually
that's
referred
nice.
to it as my sonic identity.
That's nice. Okay. I just wanted to ask about like yesterday I was having this conversation with James Shield. He's an active listener of the podcast, and he was telling me about the off the cuff episodes where there is a guest no show and all the people stay, including yourself, stay back for the entire podcast. And how is that? How do you feel about that? He was telling me that he needed more of that in the podcast, more of discussions of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, they're definitely fun to record. It's a little bit of a scramble because usually, we've gone in expecting to have a conversation about something, and then,
Mm-hmm.
as James described, it's sort of a, well, the guest is a no show, so now let's figure out what we're going to talk about, and then people will start throwing out ideas, and then we'll sort of organize it into a structure, and then just start recording and jump in. So it's definitely a fun discussion to have because
Mm-hmm.
you get to cover more things, and you oftentimes can cover things that might be just happening that week. So that's definitely fun. But yeah, it's definitely different. I guess, like, pace and structure for sure.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, like, there are many podcasts currently in the Drupal community. At least a few of them I've seen. What do you think? Why do you think Talking Drupal has survived so long, and how is it different from rest of the podcasts available regarding Drupal?
I think it being really supported by a team,
Mm-hmm.
like, I think Steven definitely deserves a lot of credit. I think he was the one who did a lot of the, editing and different things for a long time. And then when he made the decision, I think it was at episode 300,
300.
to step down, that was when they decided to make it a bit more of a team effort. So Steven is still involved a little, somewhat behind the scenes, as I'm sure you know. But then also, Nick is doing a lot of the, the editing and managing the files, and um, John is sort of, looking after getting the guest booked and some of the other things. So I think having sort of that division and sort of, spreading the work among a larger group of people has definitely been a good contributor. I also think it was after Stephen decided to step down, or sort of, become less involved, I guess is the better way to put it, that they came up with that structure of having the guest hosts on for 4 episodes. And I do think that actually brings kind of a new perspective to the conversations. And then also, because every fourth week you're getting that guest host decision on what they want to talk about, it also potentially brings other kinds of discussion that might not happen if it was just the same hosts every week. So I think those have all been really big contributors to the ongoing success. But I have seen other podcasts in the Drupal space that have been around for quite a while, but they tend to be a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like episodic, in terms of like doing a series, maybe taking a break for a while, coming back for a while, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
a cadence.
Yeah, all right. So moving on, uh, Talking Drupal is reaching 500 episodes, and it's quite a big feat. So how do you feel about that? Especially you being a part of it, and how big a deal is Talking Drupal being in 500 episodes?
I mean, I'm not really even aware of too many other podcasts that have reached that milestone. I mean, I
Awesome.
guess there are probably some that are, more than once a week that maybe are well beyond that. But definitely for something that is, really just a group of people that sort of do this in their spare time. It's not really sort of affiliated with any kind of a, podcast network or something that people are making, sizable sums of money off of or anything like that. I think it really is a sizable milestone. And I think in some ways that's a testament as well to, the vibrancy of the community, the Drupal community.
Mm-hmm.
And, just continuing to have new things to talk about week after week and year after year.
Okay. So, how important do you think like initiatives such as Talking Drupal is important for the Drupal community, especially in the terms of onboarding young talents? Like podcast is an easy medium for people to access right now, and everyone is finding time during their travel or they want to listen. That's how they find time to upskill themselves, learn about new things. So, how important do you think initiatives such as a podcast, as that of Talking Drupal, is important in bringing in new users into Drupal or new people who can contribute to Drupal?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I do think things like the series that we did a little while ago, I guess a little over a year ago, around the it was, I can't remember what we called the series, but it was basically a Drupal 7 developer who was sort of getting retrained up to sort of Drupal 10 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was probably one that would be really good for new developers to the community. They could listen in on that and sort of understand like what's a good learning path and some of those kinds of things. um, I think it's good in terms of understanding what are some of the hot topics around Drupal.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely try to have a discussion around whenever there's a new um, feature release of Drupal, to talk about what are some of the new features so that people can understand, what are capabilities that they can start taking advantage of in, things like 11.1 and those kinds of things. So yeah, hopefully it's a good resource for people who are new to the community. I would say probably not all of the episodes are sort of equally useful from that newcomer to Drupal perspective, because that isn't necessarily sort of the sole focus. But I think just being able to sort of shine a light on some of the different active conversations hopefully gets people engaged and gets them
Mm-hmm.
excited about, using Drupal and seeing it as this open source community that has a lot of excitement behind it.
Okay. So I think I've pretty much captured everything I want right now. So I'll conclude with one more question. Do you have any particular topic in mind that you would like to feature on Talking Drupal? Like something you've been bothered for too long and it's in the queue, but it has not reached there. It has not manifested into an episode yet. Do you have some topic of that sort?
Yeah, there's actually one that we're probably going to record in a couple of weeks, so I won't sort of spoil the surprise for when that gets released. But definitely something that I've actually been talking to John about that I'd like to sort of revisit as a topic
Mm-hmm.
is something that I was on as a guest for I want to say over a year ago, about the Drupal event platform, which is really sort of a version of Drupal that's designed and built to make it as easy as possible for someone wanting to organize a Drupal camp to have the setup to accept users' session submissions. Now it has a built-in rating system so that the team can evaluate which ones they think are the
Mm-hmm.
best, use that to bulk moderate those, and then it has built-in tools to schedule those into like a schedule for, so assigning like time slots and rooms, and then presenting that, online as a schedule to make it easy for users, including the ability to sort of flag which sessions they want to attend and look at sort of like a personal schedule. So the idea is to really give a lot of capabilities out of the box so that where we're trying to get to is really the point where someone organizing a Drupal camp can spin this up and really only have to be able to configure things within the UI. So not even have to, um, you know, build a custom theme. Obviously, if they wanted to build a custom theme, they could, but have enough places where they can customize it directly through the UI by having a configurable theme so they can sort of have enough of an identity so that they can just go ahead and get their camp up and running.
Great. So one more question. So
Okay.
would you change something with Talking Drupal? Would you change anything?
Hmm. Interesting question. Um, I can't think of too much I would change. I think I have one thing I've suggested that maybe we'll come around to sometime is like with the module of the week, we've got the videos up on YouTube, and I've sometimes thought it would be interesting to almost organize some of them into playlists so that you could have sort of a like
Mm-hmm.
Drupal fundamentals. So maybe there's like, the 20 modules that you should know if you're first learning about Drupal. That could be a playlist, or there could be some that's, all like ways to make views better, or, different things like that. So maybe having some playlists like those, and then that might also help to drive like, in terms of which modules that I cover, it could also help to sort of guide maybe some places in, because there were certain, let's say, playlists that we wanted to create, kind of a thing. So that's sort of like an idea that I've had percolating in my mind. Another thing that I've talked to Stephen about is maybe having some episodes that it's almost like comparing um, two different ways that you can achieve the same thing in Drupal, and discuss like which one is better and why, and sort of almost have like a um, not really a debate, but sort of discussion about two opposing ways that people do the solve the same problem, I guess is the way to put it, within Drupal, because that is one of the things in Drupal, is that oftentimes there are multiple ways to solve the same problem. And so talking through the pros and cons of different approaches to the same problem, I think sometimes can be helpful, again, for that person who might be newer to Drupal as well.